But so many people assume that to be a trickster figure sort of thing, that it's now become accepted that it is, even though that's absolute BS. This is a completely different legend, completely different thing. So it's no surprise that Susan Pike does this, because the photo taking itself. So I love doing this. And I hate this setup.
Well, this doesn't work.
Cool. So a little bit about myself. I'm running on two things. So introduction to me, my name is Tyler Pennock. The name I'm called is
said, yeah.
I'm kidding. Star Watcher, but my actual name is Nageji. So I'm from a place called Foss, Alberta. My father's family is registered to sturgeon lake cremation. My mother's mom and her parents were from Sawridge. So it's Northern Alberta. I'm an adoptee who's since connected with family. And in order to understand my community, I learned Severan Ojibwe because it's remarkably close to Plains Cree, and in fact, the writing system is the same, which it really helped in languages that have lots of dialects.
You and she can do that together.
And this whole process, this presentation is that's something that stems from something I've noticed in teaching, is that there's this idea that memorializing or getting and recording Indigenous oral traditions somehow makes it happen forever. You keep it forever as you can, because there are a number of publishing houses now that have copyright access to Indigenous legends and have now let them go out of print. So we, our own people, are unable to access our own knowledges now. So that's where this comes out of all of my presentations thus far. So I'm using something by the Miracle. I must warn folks, because I understand there are 600 nations in Canada. I do have to acknowledge that there are deceased people depicted in here. And I'll warn you, it's next slide. And also that they were friends. Cool. Okay.
That's it.
So in, this is where I start. I'll read, I'll do whatever. Okay, so in 2007, while waiting for our class to start, it was intermediate Anishinaabe, which is Severan Ojibwe. We're technically Anishinaabe, but while waiting for it, our teacher, Alex McKay, who is depicted in the slide after this one, he introduced a word randomly to us. It was Klanohotpijaks, which he might have made up. We don't know. And we sat, what's that word? What is it? What is it? And we're in intermediate language, which means we were just getting to the point where we're creating new words, but we weren't yet at the point where we would be able to fill the image from understanding the morphemes. With polysynthetic languages, the morphemes themselves have meaning that are shiftable according to where they appear in the word, right? So we hadn't yet gotten to that point. But in Alex's fashion, there was no real explanation for it, other than the fact that he was saying, she's trying to get here, but can't. And that's it. And this was during a particularly brutal thunderstorm. And so we could easily make the assumption that it's because someone was trying to get there and was on their way and was having difficulty due to the thunderstorm. The only problem being is that everyone was in class and there was no such thing happening. So because of that lack of context, that lack of explanation, that sort of thing that you would expect, having grown up in English, sort of not coming with this story, that story stuck out, that word stuck out to me in many ways since, and I really didn't understand it until much, much later. And this comes within the idea I've been developing or understanding of late, is that, contrary to popular belief, textual recording of stories also leaves a lot out. So that's how I would qualify that story, in that there wasn't much context. It really didn't apply in the moment. But this was the way that Alex taught. Often would introduce things without context, without connecting information, without stories that would give us any kind of background to it. Now, in the original presentation, this is the Miracle and Alex McKay depicted on the left. In the original presentation, I do this because so much of what I teach now is because of how they teach, which coincidentally, in evaluations, many students hated them because they didn't mark or they didn't grade appropriately to Euro-Western expectations of what you should know. They graded according to installed ways of understanding and how you should learn, which wasn't always popular. But in the original presentation I did with this at the Indigenous Literary Studies Association, my presentation was largely around Indigenous stories, and it's weird. I started the presentation and 2 days before I rewrote the whole thing, and I rewrote the whole thing because of a dream that I had, and I don't even remember the dream. And I woke up saying, screw providing the connections, they can get there on their own. No doubt whatever dream I had was likely epic, and I can't remember the context of the dream that brought that idea forward, but like all dreams, it was remarkable in that it makes fun of linear storylines, it makes fun of contextual information, and it makes fun of linear memory in many ways. And as in Alex's class that day, and as I'm doing to you, dreams also provide little context, almost on purpose. This outlines a criticism I had in that previous conference, in that stories that are read to us as children, and I suspect the stories that we read as adults now, those stories have all those contexts and all those connecting information provided for us as an expectation of English. And I'm not saying that Indigenous stories lack necessary context, but what I'm saying is that too many of the stories we learned in English provide that stuff to us too easily. Okay? And that carries over, I think, to Indigenous studies and oral traditions that we have recorded. In our efforts to produce a written record of our knowledges, we've actually erased too much. Or supplanted. I don't really know. Much of the context and meaning behind the stories that we have recorded is too easily provided, and for Indigenous written legends, often that context is provided by translators and editors who themselves are not part of the culture. And in doing this, we, as studiers of this information and people who teach these legends, we risk forgetting where much of the paratextual information exists in legends and teachings and languages, and that is within the relationships around which we tell these stories. It is within us. This is going well. In the chapter, in the story away by Craig Womack in his lovely book, Red on Red, his analysis of the Creek turtle story told by Linda Alexander includes a discussion of the conversation leading up to the story, the events around the story and after the story. It includes a discussion of Linda Alexander's translation of it from Creek language into English, and the ethnographer John Swanton's 2 English versions which were translated previously, and the differences between them. Now, what fascinated me about that chapter, and yes, I do this, but this is stars, is how he pays attention to the context of his own relationship with the story, and also his worries around transcribing the story, his own lack of fluency in Creek culture and language, and how that could influence his later analysis. He writes, for example, something we've talked about in English, that occurs in English, Roman orthography that does not occur necessarily when writing Indigenous languages. He says, in one way, one Creek verb might take many English words to render its meaning. And like many oral stories dense with narrative action, this story is verb intense. Secondly, and as has been previously stated, I think also here, oral stories tend to be metonymic because the audience already knows so much context that need not be repeated. Thus, in the Creek version, Linda probably followed traditional minimalistic presentation. In English, she may have followed the dominant culture paradigm of fuller explanation, which, is this slide? See, I've already messed it up. Oh well, that's that one. Interesting here is not only that dominant paradigm's expectations of fuller explanations necessitated the inclusion of more words, which, if you add it up over and over and over, you're getting more and more information supplanted by the dominant culture. And particularly in John Swanton's version, it accounted for things like 18th century explanations for, around style, expectations around style. Similar to, if you've read Wallace's White Roots of Peace, the linguistic sort of presentation of it is very monotheistic and very Bible-like. That's expectations of style. But there is a significant amount of information that stands in where Creek social interactions, storytelling protocol, relationships between storyteller and audience, provides the necessary details. There's significant amounts of information that can be lost. This is why I think there's a significant amount of information that gets lost when transcribing our legends and not leaving them in their original oral context. And yes, it can be lost. Concurrent to this loss is the likelihood that even in translation by Indigenous scholars, we may add nuances to concepts and words that hadn't originally included them. The translation of legends and teachings into different languages and contexts can replace Indigenous nuance with dominant approaches. What strikes me is how, and Womack does touch on this, the process operates potentially unseen, or as I slip this in there, as Said has put it, so detailed a manner as to leave few items untouched, few cultures unstudied, few peoples and spots of land. Now, can we now know it as a given, or rather an unfortunate necessary accident and a direct result of the hybrid linguistic and cultural spaces we now inhabit? Which slide is this? I think I messed it up. Oh well, sorry. What I find important is how many Indigenous peoples are aware of the erasure, the dangers of taking and studying Indigenous knowledge and stories out of cultural or linguistic contexts, and yet so many of us here occupy spaces that are not wholly community-centered, that exist within urban centers or university halls. What then is, as numerical suggests in Goodbye Snow, the freedom we are to find in the context of the narrative, and at an end in creating? One could say that we now hold partial pictures of our cultures, in which we cannot deny the often inimical spaces that many of us have grown up in. One of the ways our context has changed our appreciation of Indigenous knowledges, legends, and teachings is through translation and transcription. I've had to regularly remind my own students of the complexity of Anishinaabe word creating, that we take for granted the ease of playing with context and relationship in English by saying, it's like a cloud. In English, as a child, you knew it as something in the sky, then it became a bulbous drawing with a yellow sun in the corner of the page. Now you know the cloud as many things, and you have no difficulty understanding them all in the proper context. When we study Indigenous language, often we don't have that level of understanding of almost every region. It's no secret that loss of language complexity in one's own culture is one of the ways in which our oppression continues. I think I know one Indigenous group of people, the Guna in Panama, who still have 7 levels of their language. The Anishinaabe 7 levels, no one knows them. Cree, no one remembers them. I do believe would be able to read Dutch books. I was going to suggest his work to you, but very few can. So it's no secret that the loss of language, complexity, and context is one of the ways in which our oppression continues. Whereas in Bukiwakiongo puts it, whenever there is a situation in which domination and subordination between two groups, whatever their color or religion, this will be reflected in the language relationship, one language dominating the other. This will make sense. I don't know which slide number this is. No. Okay, I'll explain this. I use all of my slides from a course in this, and this is how I explain Judith Butler's idea of violating the interpolating call as being something far more than you make the interpolating call, more complex than they expect. So when, the old McConnor or I can't remember the other guy's name, mentioned and when a police officer says, hey, you stop, you naturally become part of that sort of context. But in terms of our own understandings, I think that interpolating call is the expectation that we either place our legends and teachings within the written word or we lose them forever. So how I encourage students in my class is to engage with that information that goes well beyond that binary, violating that expectation of the university. That's why I put that here. Yeah. And one of those ways is to try and see the text beyond the page. Yeah. Yeah. So another example that we stumbled on in my worldview, Indigenous Knowledges and Oral Traditions course is Basil Johnston's opening of the Manitus, which no one really remembers. He talks about the wayfarers and missionaries missionaries, when they recorded ideas and languages as they were leading indigenous peoples, how they drew from their observations of ceremonies what these words and what these languages would mean. One such major misconception, his words, was related to the Anishinaabe notion of God. The chief cause of this misunderstanding was the term Manitou, which from the beginning was interpreted to mean only spirit. Naturally, this narrow interpretations of the term, this is what I look at Cree speakers, distorted the essential truth of what Anishinaabe people meant. The inference followed was to be expected that Aboriginal mind was considered simple and could only understand the very simplest terms in abstract. Therefore, thereafter, whenever an Aboriginal person understood the term Manitou, Western Europeans thought it meant spirit. Western Europeans took it for granted that Aboriginal people, being a simple heart and mind, believed in the presence of little spirits in rocks, trees, groves, and waterfalls, much as the primitive peoples of Europe. Men and women who addressed the Manitus are believed to worship idols and spirits and animals, but most Aboriginal people understood their respective languages well enough to know the context and precise meaning. Manitowoc would be the particular feeling that a space has in the air. Manitowoc would be the property of a thing. And so, for example, if I were to say Puaman, which is a dream, but the property of a dream, I am not saying that I have a dream. I am saying that the property in which my dreams operate is similar to an animal that I could point out, okay? Which might be my perspective is different than yours. It does not mean you have spirit. This is slide 8. And this is also a slide I use. One of the things I do is, throughout my courses, I will also point out, as Harold Johnson does in Cry Wolf, that indigenous languages and indigenous peoples have so many understandings of different perspectives, and they accept those different perspectives in their languages and in their stories. So the idea, as has come out recently, is 2012, that spiders have a different umwelt because they perceive the world differently than we do through vibration and large lights, depending on the spider, entirely differently. Is something that is very common to indigenous peoples as an understanding or awareness from them. Same as wolves. There are so many stories about the wolves and congress of animals where wolves decide that dogs will be subservient to humans. Embedded in that story is the understanding that wolves do have a different way of socializing and a different way of perceiving the world than dogs and humans do. Some of this information often gets lost because I think dominant culture doesn't understand the capacity in one's language and legends for other perspectives existing alongside yours. Did I even say all that? Oh, yes, I did. So as you may guess, my fear of the consequences of English being the language in which we learn our stories and its dominance is that the simplification of our languages will spill out and dominate our cultural linguistic resurgence as well. And I threw this in there knowing you would be here. And this one thing has bugged me since 2000. Marie Baptiste insisted in 2000 that in every educational circumstance, much of what is learned depends on the context in which it is learned. I wonder in this how I, as a single teacher, might address the context of this possible failure that teaching or using any indigenous knowledges in an English language context in the university. What can I do to undermine the dominance in English that I spoke of? Now, one of these is Jeanette Armstrong in Land Speaking. If you recall, she talks about the nature of polysynthetic languages, as I've already pointed out. I have one for dog, but I think she has one for dog as well, if I can remind you. She says an example of the Okanagan word for dog is getquet. I may have spoken that wrong, but I will keep trying until I get it right. About the elastic meaning that it has. She writes, the word has two syllables. The first syllable, get, and the action syllable meaning like happening on a small thing is what that is. The second syllable, wet, meaning something like spreading profusely, as in fur. The fur is implied. In English, the two together would not make specific sense. However, when these two syllables are combined in Okanagan, they immediately come together to become an activator of a larger image. they create an action together for growing on a living thing, which is not unlike SLA, which you leave the description behind and you go straight to the creation of the context that creates a picture. Throughout worldviews, oral traditions, and indigenous knowledges, of course, I regularly open discussions to this sort of idea. And I usually use Animush as one of them. Anim is like adim, which is, you can say it means 4 legs, but it doesn't necessarily mean 4 legs, it means all planted. Right? So if you have Animakit, which is thunder, it literally describes the lightning touching the ground. Which is why Anishinaabe people have that as a symbol, it's their word. But Animush literally means, like when you're talking about the SH on the end of it, if it's a legend or a creature, it means the being who does this, the being who's on all 4s. And the answer to that is something that a teacher has to create. Have you ever seen a dog walk comfortably on 2 legs? Right. So then I wonder, when I bring this forward in my class, I ask students, if you together could create an observation about dogs that you can understand in your context, what would that word be? Right? It would be easy to leave my concept or teachings and everything at that, to say that there is or was a real danger to envisioning indigenous resurgence without paying attention to what was not written. It's certainly not true. Across Turtle Island, we talked about how much we are attempting to learn languages and cultures in a kind of ecosystem of many things we're attempting to recover. And those relationships, as they grow and build among one another between indigenous cultural and linguistic resurgence and stories and relationships and building communities, we see a kind of reclamation and progress where people are tending to elders and language nests and the whole bit. I caution that too can be rushed, that we should pay attention to the dominance that English has when we use it in the institutions where we try to bring these things forward. And one of the ways in which I get my students to do this is I tell them to slow down. Because we live, I think as Billy Riddell has pointed out with Judith Butler, saying that we live in a world of citational language, where it's easy to bring forward the ideas of what someone has said without acknowledging sometimes the full genealogy of where that knowledge came through. Wendy Genius Mary Genius in Plants Have So Much to Give Us, when she's talking about Kiwaitinukwe, she talks about the documentation required in an oral culture, which is that when one person shares knowledge, they acknowledge how that knowledge has passed from one person, one generation to the next, the stories that have been gathered along the way, and the context in which the person has learned the story. It is far more detailed in terms of citation than English is, than many of the systems that we have used are. So that's how I get them to sort of slow down. And what I attempt in my classes is to bring forward a genealogy of knowledge, not only from teacher to student, generation over generation. I'm also hoping to impress upon students the importance of knowledge through each context, each iteration, to pay attention to how much the context of anything we study creates the kind of inheritance that we can and should trace in its evolution to the context we now understand. That involves, if you're studying a legend, know where it came from in the source, and know how you are changing your understanding based on how your context is created. Yes. So, interestingly enough, I believe stories to be a representation of entropy, devised to be like, we represent the entropy that we see in the land around us. And while some people view entropy as something that a single organism might undergo in terms of disappearing, entropy is also the study of how an ecosystem of organisms adapt to change. Thereby, the ecosystem continues and continues living. It becomes a process or an organized change where one thing fills the empty space once occupied. Armstrong mentioned this in context, that the land informs the dialects. Leslie Marmon Silko has mentioned the same, in that the land informs the stories and the languages that we speak. Womack argued for indigenous discourse informed by indigenous worldviews, and all of us are clamoring for language to be relearned. For a return to complex multi-level languages with multiple vibrant dialects and community-based interpretations. and me being in the context of university learning, I think we should not keep the boundary between academia and community so contiguous that we forget that as teachers, we also have an opportunity to create a fostering climate for the knowledges that we study, for they are too living. For that, I also caution we must be absolutely transparent about the ways we've had to adapt to the space we occupy, with our students, with ourselves, and with any other group. So how do I tackle this as a teacher in Indigenous knowledges, creative expression, and language? I'm no longer a language teacher, but that's fine. I like it. So how do I do this? I use discussion methods that draw on student experience and learning. I encourage students to bring resources from outside and discuss with each other. I will often do this and ensure that I'm not like the person you see. I usually end a class with a quotation by someone else or beg the student to recap the entire thing, removing me and the institution from the entire process if I can. I encourage depth of understanding over memory by including this in clear, transparent grading rubrics. And for oral tradition courses, these are scaffolded, preferencing depth of analysis and evidence that a student has considered the concept or why. I encourage connection between related texts in very much the same way that we do in oral traditions, through a lens of relationality. So I will encourage different culture concepts of, for example, stone canoe, or the canoe that moves by itself, in order for students to understand the relationality of one culture to another and bring understanding to themselves. Alex used to say, in studying my culture, you learn your own. Which I do with Kriva, which many settler populations managed to do in his course as well. And I also create presentations that have very little text, requiring students to make the connection between the images that I'm placing there and what I'm saying on their own. And I also encourage examining the source and context of any Indigenous knowledges they bring in. I'm particularly scathing when people say, I had a teaching once. That teaching was for that context, not here. So in this, I intend to create as much as possible connective experiences that students can use to understand better the depth of Indigenous knowledges and how their intertextuality differs from the dominant society. And that holders of much of the information needed to understand them are the listeners themselves, the learners, the people themselves, and the context of the relationships they engender when they enter a room to hear this knowledge. In this way, I hope the unseen, the blank spaces that Orientalist and patriarchal approaches to our cultures are unraveled. Or rather, I hope to expose students as much as possible to the unwritten pieces that go alongside oral knowledges. In this way, teaching style can be considered a kind of education method that is fractal and not Euclidean, where I also encourage students to treat the knowledges as I do in the beginning, where I bring the context for it. Or as Robert Wall Kimmerer points out in Braiding Sweetgrass, in an animate sense, where the reciprocity you're getting is much larger than person to person. It includes the further, even unknown relationships that you will encounter many years in the future coming back to you. Or a conscious reweaving to meet the constant change that something undergoes, a kind of dawao in terms, or nawa, which is to create a circle of something in reciprocity. I'm going to finish with the recollection of where I started this, in that of a dream. I do dreams because they make fun of linear storylines and exact events, much in the same way that memory can provide an accurate picture of cannot provide an accurate picture of anything. I know that I am providing a third transcription of that, a reiteration of the dream, the memory recall, compiling possible errors in experience. If you consider this impact as a margin of error, the difference between the original event I talked about and the recall multiplied, then you may assume that its iteration is no longer close enough to the original to be considered, a special event termed unremarkable through over-articulation. However, if you are Indigenous, this is a dangerous assumption. And I counter that our languages and that our attention to context and our attention to relationality and proximity to any event in the story that we're telling is a way of creating in any story a much longer life and shelf life than any written version of the story could ever manage. There are stories in the Southern Hemisphere that are 60,000 Not so in written culture, if we could write alphabetical literacy that way. My fear is that there exists a kind of gravitational pull in academia and society toward the exchange of static ideas alone, and that academia invariably draws its participants toward monolithic ideas and essentialized understandings of our cultures through intertextual repetition, eschewing the social context they were fostered in. And for us, as the people whose cultural searching takes part now in many universities, we can always attempt a more animate form of growth through multiple contexts, prepare for that, and be definitely aware of it. I'm going to go back to the original quotation, but I'm going to give you another one to layer it. And this is on the TRC, which I brought forward. This was by Brady and Kelly. We interrupt this program. Many who experience physical and emotional difficulty providing testimonials criticize and resisted aspects of the statement gathering process and adapted testimonials for their own purposes. For example, some survivors referenced residential schools but critiqued current government policies. Testimonials were intertextual, shaped not only by the survivor's experience and the TRC guidelines, but also by other testimonials, media texts such as the film We Were Children, which was referenced in those recordings, and indigenous oral traditions and cultural cues that existed outside the textual form of that record. They also serve, though what they have done, later on they say, also served as vehicles for critique, knowledge transfer, and belonging within communities. And this is what I attempt to create in my class as much as possible. That